Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today it's our pleasure to present the 1955 production, Mr. ARKADIN, written and directed by Orson Welles. This is one of those Welles films that continues to generate controversy. It uses the same structure as Citizen Kane, but it's more on the side of a mystery thriller. It's also an international film that tours virtually all of Europe. We'll be talking about that, some of the controversies surrounding the film, many of its virtues, and a set of other things after today's screening. It's a pleasure to welcome back to City Cinematheque the distinguished director, author, actor, and film historian, Peter Bogdanovich, who is also a good friend of Orson Welles. Now, take this opportunity to enjoy the many and diverse pleasures of Mr. ARKADIN. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this almost global tour that you had in the last almost 2 hours with Orson Welles' films, Mr. ARKADIN. Joining us as a guide to sort of the tour of that film itself is himself a distinguished filmmaker, returning to City Cinematheque, the director, author, actor, and film historian, Peter Bogdanovich. Pleasure to have you back, Peter.
Nice to be back, Jerry. Thanks.
Great. Now, you had the pleasure of knowing Orson Welles rather well. Would you tell us a little bit about what was going on with Welles in the period in which he was making this film? What was the sort of conditions of his life as an artist and as a man?
Well, he had won the grand prize at Cannes in 1952 for Othello. Though the picture was despised in America, it was quite well thought of in Europe. There's a funny story to that. It was entered as a Moroccan entry. and is the only Moroccan film that ever won a grand international prize. Though it's perfectly, it was an American film, but he entered as a Moroccan film because he shot some of it in Morocco.
Absolutely.
Anyway, he'd made that film, and he was doing all sorts of things as usual, doing radio still. And one of the radio shows that he did was this series called The Adventures of Harry Lime, based on his character in The Third Man.
Right.
And he wrote some of them. One of them he wrote was Greek Meets Greek, I think was the name of it. And anyway, it was the plot of Mr. ARKADIN, which is also known in some quarters as Confidential Report.
Right.
And he thought it was a good plot. The plot is that this rich guy tries to hire somebody to find out about himself so that he can knock off the people who know anything he doesn't want known.
Right. That's
basically the setup. And he thought it would make a good picture, so he wrote a script. I wrote a few scripts, evidently a couple. Anyway, and but the making of the editing of what became known in some quarters as Mr. ARKADIN and other quarters as Confidential Report was very stressful. And evidently he didn't finish it at the time when the financiers wanted him to, so they simply took it away from him. And the final cut of this film was never achieved. He never got to a final cut. In fact, he was very unhappy about this film and thought it was one of the most butchered of all his films.
Right.
There's an interesting I have a sort of personal connection to it that goes even beyond. Before I ever met Orson, I didn't meet him until 1968.
Okay.
But in 1961, I was asked to program the first Orson Welles retrospective in the United States at the Museum of Modern Art. And in January of '61, the retrospective was in May of that year. In January of '61, I flew to California for the first time. And I had heard that this small television syndication company, called M&A Alexander, I can't believe I remember that, but I had heard that they had a print. They owned the U.S. rights to Confidential Report, Mr. ARKADIN, and I had heard that they had a print that might be better than the ones in Europe. Well, I hadn't seen the film, so they were out in the San Fernando Valley. I called them, and the picture never opened in America. It's now '61, so it's 5-6 years after it had opened in Europe. and gotten sort of thrown away. And I went out to this little place out in the San Fernando Valley and saw a 16mm print, and that's how I first saw this film. And it was this version. I said, what versions do you have? Well, we have one that's longer than the other. I said, well, let me see the longer one. This was the version, the one you've shown, which has an elaborate kind of flashback structure, flashing back from Van Straten talking to Akim Tamirov's character, Zook. Now, other versions of the film tried to put the flashback into chronological order, which is something like taking Citizen Kane and trying to put that in chronological order, which would be a disaster. And I've seen a few other versions. There are, in fact, I'm told, 7 different versions of Confidential Report, or Mr. ARKADIN. Anyway, subsequent to my finding this version, and there was a 35mm print, it was opened at the New Yorker Theater, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was Dan Talbot's first theater in New York, and on 89th and Broadway. And it opened and got reviewed, and luckily the critic was, at the Times, was a Orson Welles fan, and wrote a pretty good review. And that was the first time, as a result, that was the first time the film opened in the United States, and then it was shown at the retrospective that we did. So that was how Mr. ARKADIN came to America.
Well, and it's also one of those films that, as a consequence of that, was, if I can say this, was one of the films that haunted rep cinemas throughout the 60s and the 70s, when there were repertory cinemas throughout many of the United States cities. That was not a film that many people had ever been able to see in this first release at the New Yorker. It was one of those things that people would go, oh, there's that other Orson Welles film that nobody's ever seen, and that one could go and see it in those ways.
It has the classic, well, sort of, I don't know, maybe the one of the most defining moments in all his movies, which is the scene when he tells the story of the scorpion and the frog.
Indeed.
Which so many people have latched on to. Orson told me it was an old Arab legend he'd heard, fairy tale. I probably have that wrong, but I hope I'm right. But I think it was Arab. Anyway, and he tells it wonderfully in the story. You know, I can't help it. It's my character. Let's drink to character. And I asked Orson, I said, do you break the world into scorpions and frogs? No, there's a lot of other animals.
He got a lot of animals to act in this film for him, didn't he? I mean, it's a film that sort of tours Europe. I mean, both in the story, but also in the different actors he recruited.
All different kinds of, and really an international cast. I think the 2 greatest performances in the picture are probably Michael Redgrave in that hairnet. Orson used to say, God, it was so daring of Michael to put on that hairnet. I always admired him for that, you know, in that wonderful performance as that sort of antiquarian. Do you want a telescope? It's a wonderful scene. And the other scene that I think is extraordinary is the one with Tatina Paxinow, who remembers her. I was crazy in love with him, mister. It's great stuff. It's a wonderful picture, despite all the different edits and everything. Seeing it again in this version that you showed, which, as I said, is the best version. If you have to pick one, it is the best one. It's an extraordinary film. Orson didn't like to talk about it too much because it was so butchered. And he said he always felt it was one of the best movie plots he'd ever thought up, and here it was sort of ruined for him.
Well, what do you think? You know, this will probably remain a controversial film because it's not really his cut, but yet you can watch this film for 1 minute or 3 minutes or 30 seconds, whatever. And if you've ever seen another Welles film and you admire Welles's work, you know this is Orson Welles.
Oh yeah, there's no question about it. The signature is very apparent.
Yeah. So what do you take to be, let's just use this as a jumping off point to some of the virtues of Welles's cinema. What do you know, Citizen Kane, I think many of us agree, always comes up top on the list of
Well,
greatest.
it's the only it's mostly the one everybody's seen.
Well, exactly.
The rest of them are so hard to see, except for Amberson's, which is butchered. The last half hour is just not even near what he had in mind.
Right.
And there's about an hour missing.
Yeah.
From that film.
Yeah.
But Kane there's only about 2 or 3 films of his that came out in the form that he intended.
Right.
Kane is one of them. Chimes at Midnight is another one. It's almost impossible to see. That's his Falstaff film, which he thought was his best film, and I have to say it probably is. It's an extraordinary film.
There's also a very good, I mean, the most important thing is to see the film, but I should say that there's also a very good script version of the film for people who want to see how Welles put together a script and read it.
Of Chimes at Midnight?
Of Chimes at Midnight, absolutely.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. There's also a very good one of Touch of Evil
yes.
as well. So if people want to look at him as a screenwriter, because these are taken from the definitive prints and what was the film as it was released in the versions he wished, people can...
I'm not a big fan of reading scripts of movies. I know what you mean, of course, if you want to study it, but you know, the movie, it's such a visual medium, and with Orson, more than anybody else, because it's always, so much depends on how he shoots it and where the camera is and what the lighting is and the cutting and the kind of impatient editing that informs Mr. ARKADIN, because it's very cutting.
Absolutely.
Was sort of the way he made films in Europe, much more than in America. There are very few sustained shots in Mr. ARKADIN, as there are very few in Othello.
Right.
Because, as he told me, he rarely had the cast in one place. So he you know, had to cut and then do the over-shoulder shot of somebody else at another time. He told me in the trial, there's actually a couple of scenes where, you know, one shot is in Paris and then over-shoulder shot is in Zagreb or something, you know. And he did the same thing in Othello, because he was always, you know, making these films on the run. He had a tough time making films. Somehow he managed to make them extraordinary anyway. Absolutely
the case. So let's talk about that sort of general thing about his contribution. I mean, what is it? We're all admirers of Welles. From your point of view, as someone both who knows his cinema, who is also a director who knows what it means to make this kind of cinema, what are some of the marks of the accomplishment of Wellesian cinema? What is it that makes his cinema so distinctive, from your point of view?
Well, I don't know how to sum that up for you, but you know, I think the great films that have been made reflect a certain personality. Hawks's films, Mr. Hawks over there smiling, reflect very much his personality. Right. I was fortunate to know him, and I have to say they certainly do. Hitchcock, we all know that what Hitchcock was like because we got the chance to see him introduce his series. So the films that I've always liked best, you know, are the ones where you can recognize the personality of the filmmaker. I'm less interested in films that are sort of objectively well done, but that don't have a particular personality behind them, because I like to be in the company of the artist who made the film, and when you see a Welles film, you do feel like you're with him. I don't think Woody Allen, of course, said to me once in conversation a couple of years ago that he feels that Welles is the only American director who goes along with the great European directors like Renoir and Fellini and so on. I don't know that I agree, but I would say that he is the only sort of conscious, creative director, consciously artistic director who didn't apologize for being an artist in American movies.
Nor did he apologize for being an intellectual or having an extraordinary, a vast knowledge of not merely of American culture, but of world culture.
Yeah, that's why it's so ironic that he was known to so many people in America toward the end as, doing commercials for wine. No wine before its time and all that. But he needed to make a living, and that's how he financed his movies. A lot of the work he did was from doing commercials or acting in other people's movies. He'd take the money and finance his own work. It doesn't speak terribly well of the American film industry that they couldn't find a place for us. And of course, he used to say that he had a better time of it before the studio system fell apart, that it was actually easier for him to make films while the studio system existed, which was till about 1960, because the old moguls tolerated him better than the independents do, because independents are making one picture, whereas the studio would make 40 pictures, so there was room for one Orson Welles loony movie, But I've noticed over the years, since I first started writing or talking and getting to know Orson, I got to know him in the late 60s, but I've noticed that the climate has changed over the years. He was sort of dismissed as, he made Citizen Kane and that's it. And now so many people talk about him as maybe the greatest film director of all. Certainly Kane keeps topping the list of the best films ever made, which would strike him as ironic because he didn't think so. And it was the one film he was very, like pulling teeth to get him to talk about Citizen Kane, because the only picture anybody ever wanted him to talk about. Right. I remember sitting at dinner with him once with Norman Mailer after we taped a television show. And Norman sat down, first thing he said was, "Now I wanted to ask you about this shot in Citizen Kane." And Orson said, "Oh God, Norman, not Citizen Kane." And there was a pause, and Mailer looked at him and said, oh yeah, I guess it's like me and the Naked and the Dead." Meaning, the only one that anybody ever wants to talk to Mailer or Welles about are their first big success. But Orson's movies were always ahead of their time, and it's tough to be ahead of your time. Yeah, I remember, sadly, that I guess it must have been about 6 months before he died. We were having a conversation on the phone, and I don't know apropos of what, but he said, I'll never forget it, "God, how they'll love me when I'm dead." And he was right again. Absolutely on the mark. Yeah. Well, Orson was so intimidating to many people, and he was such a rebuke. His presence alone was such a rebuke to mediocrity that just a lot of people just didn't want to be around that, except for briefly, maybe for an hour or so they could say they had dinner with Orson Welles, and dine out on that for the rest of their lives. God, I used to watch him entertain prospective backers and sometimes even pick up the tab, often. And I got so angry watching these people eating off of him and getting all these wonderful stories, and then they wouldn't give him anything in return. Yeah. There's a way in which, out of necessity, in the 1950s, as he's putting together things like Othello or Mr. ARKADIN or whatever, you could say that just out of necessity, he was one of the first important American independent filmmakers, because he was putting all these things together. He was producing or working with these independent international producers. Well, Jerry, actually, you put your finger on it. The independent, I would say that the independent American cinema begins with Othello. It's the first American film, even though he entered it as a Moroccan entry. He's an American filmmaker. It's the first American film that was self-financed, all done by himself, all done independent, and then he sold it to various people. In fact, it's one of the only films, if not the only film, that his estate, that he still owned when he died. He owned the rights to it, and his estate inherited it. So the independent American cinema begins with Orson Welles as Othello, and there's a long hiatus, and then there's John Cassavetes' Shadows, and then there's Faces, John Cassavetes, and so on. But and I think Faces really kicked it off in terms of commerciality, because it's the first one that was successful. Absolutely. But you could say it begins with Orson.
Yeah, no, I think this, and also I have to say that this film that we've just seen also illustrates some of the dangers of independence, because one of the reasons there's these controversies over all of the different versions is because he didn't have final control of that, because various investors took back things or got control of it, etc. So there's there's a lesson in Othello, and there's a lesson in this, in exactly what happens when you step outside those structures as well.
Well, that's right. Othello, he financed himself, so he did control it more. This one was financed by French, Louis Dolivet, I think, and a couple other people.
Right.
So they took it away from him. It's tragic, but I try to focus on the positive. Right. And don't say, look at how little we got, but look how much we got, considering that he had to scramble to make every single movie he ever made. You know, the other thing about Orson people don't realize is he never had a commercial success except the one film of his, which he used to disown, which was a film called The Stranger.
Oh, indeed,
which
yes.
I think you've shown.
Yes, and we have.
And it's a perfectly good suspense picture with Orson and Loretta Young and Edward G. Robinson. But he did it, he said, to prove that he could make a movie just like everybody else. It doesn't really seem just like everybody else.
I was about to say, it's one of those things, again, about 30 seconds into this, you're saying, I don't think this is a normal picture from the studio at this moment.
No, but it is more normal than most of his pictures. But I used to, when I was we were doing this book together, that's how our friendship began, because he asked me to write a book about him, an interview book, in order to, quote, set the record straight about his life and career, which needed some, and sad to say the book wasn't even published until 7 years after he died, but that's another story. But I would ask him questions like, how come you put the camera in such a crazy place, or why did you do that odd angle, or whatever, and he kept looking at me blankly, and I wondered why I was not getting a response. And finally he said, well, it didn't look odd to me, And it didn't look, I didn't think it was an odd place to put it, just seemed to look better that way. Like I said, why did you put the camera down low for that big scene in Citizen Kane? Why'd you put it on the ground? Actually, he dug a hole in the floor. It just seemed to look better from there. And I said, well, that's all you can say. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to be so Philistine, but I can't think of a better reason. And he said, then he finally said to me, he says, you see, I'm like the guy that goes to the doctor and says, doctor, I don't know, there's something wrong, I don't feel well. The doctor says, oh, well, tell me what you do from the moment you wake up in the morning until you go to sleep. Tell me everything that happens to you. Well, okay, I wake up, then I vomit, then I brush my teeth, then wait, the doctor says, wait a minute, you mean you vomit every morning after you wake up? The guy says, yeah, doesn't everybody? So Orson's point was that it's just normal for him. Right. He saw it from there, and it seemed perfectly normal for him. And so that's why I think there isn't anything, he's not self-conscious, because it doesn't seem that he's trying to do something crazy. It does feel organic. Right. The other thing is he gets wonderful performances from actors. He inspires actors. And having acted for him in his last, as yet not unedited, still unedited film, The Other Side of the Wind, which we still on knock wood have hope will come out one of these days, one of these years.
Let's hope so.
It's sitting in a vault with John Huston and an extraordinary cast, Lily Palmer and just about everybody in Hollywood that was alive in 1970, 71, 2, 3, 4, 5. But I worked with him as a leading actor in that picture, and it's hard to describe what he was like. I've watched Hawks over there and Hitchcock work and Ford. I had the privilege of watching those men work, certainly three giants of the cinema and others that I watched make films. But there wasn't anybody like Orson. Everybody else was fascinating to watch, but in a certain way conventional compared to Orson. There was something about the atmosphere on his set and the mood that he created with the actors. It's impossible to describe, but he made you feel so at ease, so like we weren't working, it was fun. And nothing was wrong.
Okay.
He might want to do it differently, but it wasn't wrong. It was such great, good spirits on his set.
And it sounds like a safety net as well, that you could risk things and nobody was going to slap your hand for
You
it.
never felt a danger of being told, what the hell are you doing, or
Right,
anything
yeah.
like that, you know. I mean, the worst it would get was Orson would break up and say, I think we can do it better than that, don't you? Or something, you know. He was he was an extraordinary sense of humor, which he didn't make many comedies. In fact, he never made a comedy, a film comedy. But he was really funny in life and had and appreciated humor and had a really great sense of humor. I mean, if he were here and he laughed, you could hear it, you know, next door, down the block. I mean, his laugh shook the room. And his laugh used to resonate because he laughed on so many levels of appreciation, it seemed, that sometimes, you know, you'd get exhausted trying to keep laughing with him.
Right.
Because he saw so many different things that were funny. It seemed to me different levels of humor that he saw.
Well, you also get the sense, even through the films, none of which are comedies, but there are very high-spirited moments in so many of the films, and you just get the sense of a good humor about the situation. I mean, I'm thinking even of scenes in Kane or whatever, in which the young hijinks of the young Kane, and the spirit that seems to be a spirit that's transmitted from Welles. I mean, you know it. You know it on a first-hand basis. I'm only reading it from the film, so it's not as if he's even telling a joke or has to make a comedy, but that comic vision is somehow
well.
there.
He had the gift of perennial youth. Even when he was, pushing 70, he died at 70, unfortunately. But in his 60s, he didn't seem old.
Right.
He never seemed elderly. He always had this kind of youthful quality about him, this irreverence, kind of somewhat mischievous. One film of his that when we first met in '68, end of '68, and all I can say is, I was an abject admirer of his, and rather excited to meet him, but a bit terrified. I'd already met a lot of famous people,
Right.
And yet when I met him, within 15 minutes, I was so disarmed that I felt I could say anything to him. I felt like I'd known him for 10 years, that I could say, and I did. Imagine I had the nerve to say, the one film of yours I don't really like is The Trial. And he said, I don't either. And then it turned out it wasn't true.
Well, we're going to have to keep that as the kind of teaser to make people continue watching and also reading what you have written about him, because we've come to an end of our 30 minutes.
Oh well, it's swift. It moves along quickly, Jerry.
Moves along quickly. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, please visit our website, www.cuny.tv. Let me give you that information again, www.cuny.tv. Peter, a great pleasure to have you here, sharing your wealth of knowledge about Orson Welles.
Always great to talk about Orson.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
we hope to
Jerry.
see you again sometime on CUNY TV.
So, thank you.
And I hope that you join us once again as we try to explore the archives of film history from a global perspective, and I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.